I remember the houses first, because they were all open. Doors hung loose like someone had left in a hurry. Windows were cracked, but not broken, like something pushed from inside. Furniture stood untouched, yet covered in a thin gray dust. I stepped into one kitchen and heard nothing at all. No insects, no pipes, no distant ocean, just an empty pressure. A plate sat on the table with food hardened into stone. Whoever lived there didn't plan to leave that day. I checked the bedrooms and found beds stripped halfway through sleep. Blankets twisted like people had fought something they could not see. One house had writing on the wall, scratched with bare hands. It said the door was not a door anymore. I didn't understand that until I saw the hallway. The air shimmered there, like heat, but the house was freezing cold. I reached out, and something in my head recoiled before my hand did. It felt like standing at the edge of a drop. Except there was no drop, just a normal wooden floor. By the time I got there officially, the story had already spread. Local news called it a coastal anomaly nobody could explain. State officials used softer words, but they meant the same thing. They told people to stay away and avoid unnecessary panic. That didn't work because panic was already everywhere. Families had left overnight, taking nothing but what they carried. Some didn't even take their cars, just vanished on foot. The sheriff told me people were talking about a doorway. Not a metaphor, but something real, something opening in homes. They said you could feel it before you saw anything unusual. A pressure, a pull, like something waiting on the other side. A pastor came on television and called it a thinning veil. He said the town had been chosen for something beyond understanding. Property prices dropped almost overnight, faster than I'd ever seen. 40% gone because fear spreads quicker than any fire. They marked the whole district as unsafe without giving real reasons. That's usually when I start paying attention. What didn't make sense wasn't that people were afraid. Fear is predictable when something disrupts routine without explanation. What didn't make sense was how consistent the stories sounded. Different families described the same sensation without talking to each other. They all mentioned the air changing before anything visible happened. They all said the space felt deeper than it should be. One man swore his hallway stretched longer while he watched it. A woman said she heard voices coming from inside her walls. Not outside, not neighbors, but inside the structure itself. And every single person left at almost the same point. right when they believed the house was no longer stable reality. That's not how panic usually works in isolated incidents. Panic spreads unevenly, shaped by personality and environment differences. This felt synchronized, almost engineered, and that bothered me more. So the real question wasn't whether something strange happened there. The question was how something could control perception that precisely. Before everything collapsed, the town moved with a steady rhythm. Boats left before sunrise, engines low, cutting through cold Atlantic water. Men worked the traps while gulls circled and screamed overhead. Women ran small stores, diners, and the only hardware shop in town. Kids biked along narrow roads without ever looking over their shoulders. Everyone knew each other, or at least knew someone who did. I saw photos later, pinned to walls people abandoned overnight. Barbecues, birthdays, ordinary smiles that meant nothing at the time. There was a school with chipped paint and a stubborn basketball hoop. The kind of place where nothing ever really changes. Fishermen complained about weather, not about reality breaking apart. Evenings smelled like salt, diesel, and fried food from the pier. No one locked their doors unless a storm was coming. It was simple, predictable, almost boring in the best way. That life didn't fade slowly or drift into something else. It stopped, like someone flipped a switch nobody could see. The first report sounded like a maintenance issue nobody cared about. A couple complained about a strange smell coming through their vents. They described it as damp, sweet, and slightly metallic. The landlord sent someone, but nothing obvious was found inside. A week later, the same couple mentioned feeling dizzy at night. They said the air felt heavier in the hallway than usual. Nobody connected those details to anything serious at the time. Then another house reported the same smell, almost word for word. That got attention, but still not urgency or real investigation. The maintenance records showed recent cleaning of several ventilation systems. It was logged as routine work, nothing unusual or suspicious. But the timing lined up too neatly when I reviewed it later. The first family left suddenly 3 days after that cleaning. They didn't call anyone, didn't explain, just disappeared overnight. Neighbors assumed something personal had gone wrong behind closed doors. By the third house, people started whispering instead of asking questions. That's when something small stopped being small anymore. Once fear took hold, explanations followed the path of least resistance. People didn't look for mechanics, they looked for meaning instead. A local fisherman claimed the water had changed weeks before anything happened. He said the tides felt wrong, like something was pulling differently. A woman insisted she saw shapes moving behind her walls at night. The sheriff didn't dismiss it, which made things worse quickly. They brought in a state consultant who avoided giving concrete answers. He used phrases like environmental anomaly and localized disturbance patterns. That's when the pastor stepped forward with something clearer and darker. He called it a thinning between worlds, not a structural issue. According to him, the town sat on something ancient and unstable. People prefer certainty, even when that certainty is terrifying nonsense. Officials eventually marked the area as unfit for habitation indefinitely. No criminal investigation, no clear hazard, just a quiet closure. Media picked up the story and leaned hard into the supernatural angle. Tourists stopped coming, investors pulled out, and silence settled in. By then, nobody wanted a real answer anymore, just distance. I wasn't brought in because of ghosts or rumors. I work environmental investigations, mostly air quality and contamination cases. My job usually starts when something invisible starts hurting people quietly. Factories, mold, chemical leaks, things nobody notices until it's too late. I don't chase stories, I follow measurable changes in the environment. That's why the call caught my attention immediately. They said multiple houses showed no structural damage, but triggered evacuations. No fire, no gas explosion, no clear biological hazard on record. Just fears strong enough to empty an entire neighborhood overnight. That's not superstition. That's a pattern with a physical cause. I've seen panic before, but never this synchronized across families. So I asked for reports, maintenance logs, and access to properties. Most people there already decided it wasn't my kind of problem. They thought I was wasting time measuring something beyond science. I didn't argue, because I've heard that line too many times. If something affects the body, it leaves a trace somewhere. And I knew exactly where to start looking. The first house felt wrong, but not in a supernatural way. The air had a weight to it that didn't match the temperature. I brought sensors, but readings came back frustratingly normal at first. No gas spikes, no obvious toxins, nothing that explained hallucinations. Still, people don't abandon homes without a trigger you can measure. So I stopped relying on instruments and started using my eyes. I checked vents, filters, ducts, every place air could travel through. That's when I noticed something along the inside vent panel. A thin line ran across the metal surface, perfectly straight. It looked like residue, but too uniform to be random growth. Natural mold spreads unevenly, shaped by moisture and airflow patterns. This line ignored all of that, like it had been placed there. I scraped a sample and sealed it carefully for later analysis. Then I checked other houses and found the same line again. Same height, same thickness, same unnatural precision across properties. Nobody mentioned it in any report or inspection summary. That told me something important had been hiding in plain sight. I needed to know if that residue could explain everything people felt. So I recreated the conditions as closely as I could manage. Same type of ventilation system, same airflow rate, same humidity levels. I even sourced similar building materials from the same regional suppliers. Then I introduced the collected sample into the controlled environment. At first, nothing happened, just like in the field readings earlier. That almost made me doubt the direction I was taking. But I adjusted one variable that reports kept mentioning repeatedly. Blankets twisted like people had fought something they could not see. Within hours, the air started to change in a subtle way. Not toxic, not immediately dangerous, but definitely not normal anymore. I stayed inside longer than I probably should have. The space began to feel deeper than it physically was. Corners stretched slightly, like perspective was being pulled apart gently. I heard something faint that wasn't coming from any device nearby. When I opened a window and broke the sealed environment, it stopped. That was the moment everything shifted from mystery to mechanism. Once I isolated the sample, the pattern finally made sense. It wasn't just mold, at least not the kind people usually imagine. This strain produced airborne compounds that interfered with neural processing subtly. Not enough to poison, but enough to distort perception under certain conditions. In sealed environments, concentration increased just below standard detection thresholds. That's why my instruments didn't flag it immediately. The compounds affected spatial awareness and auditory interpretation first. Your brain starts misjudging distance, depth, and the direction of sound sources. Hallways feel longer because your visual cues stop aligning properly. Walls seem alive because your brain fills gaps with imagined movement. The faint voices people described came from misprocessed ambient noise patterns. Air pressure shifts inside ducts created low-frequency vibrations I could measure later. Combined with the chemical effect, it amplified the sense of something present. Not visible, but undeniably there, pressing against your awareness constantly. Temperature drops made the compound more active and more easily airborne. Everything people described matched the interaction between chemistry and environment perfectly. No portals, no thinning realities, just a controlled disruption of human perception. It was never supernatural, just carefully engineered physics working quietly. After that, I went back through every report with new eyes. The maintenance log suddenly read like a sequence instead of random entries. Vent systems were cleaned in a specific order across the neighborhood. Each house received service within days of the previous one. That's not how routine maintenance usually gets scheduled. Someone was moving deliberately, not responding to random service calls. The residue lines matched access points where vents were opened manually. Same height, same placement, consistent with someone applying material by hand. Families reported symptoms only after those visits were completed. First the smell, then the pressure, then the distortion of space. It escalated predictably as the compound spread through each system. When people finally panicked, they left everything behind immediately. That timing mattered more than anything else I had seen. Because abandoned properties don't just sit empty without consequences. Ownership becomes complicated, values drop, and control shifts quietly. Whoever did this understood both chemistry and real estate dynamics. That narrowed my list faster than any lab result ever could. There was one name that kept appearing across contracts and permits. Evan owned several of the affected properties through layered companies. Not enough to stand out at first, but enough to matter. He used to share a business with another local developer years ago. That partnership ended badly, with lawsuits and accusations never fully resolved. After the split, Evan started losing money on multiple investments. Maintenance costs rose while property values stayed frustratingly flat. Then suddenly, values collapsed across the entire district at once. That kind of drop creates opportunity if you're positioned correctly. I checked who was buying parcels quietly after families left. Shell entities, but all connected back to Evan eventually. He wasn't just surviving the crash, he was driving it. Fear did the work for him while he stayed in the background. People don't negotiate when they believe their homes are cursed. They sell fast, cheap, and without asking too many questions. Everything pointed toward intent, not coincidence or environmental accident. At that point, the mask wasn't fully off, but it was slipping. The more I dug, the worse it became. It was just a handful of houses affected by this pattern. The same ventilation work appeared in properties outside the main district. Some families left quietly without ever speaking to officials or neighbors. Their stories never made the news or official reports. That kept the scale hidden longer than anyone realized. I mapped timelines, and the activity stretched back several months earlier. Long before panic reached the point of public attention, Evan had been refining the method, improving consistency with each property. Small adjustments, better timing, more controlled spread-through ventilation systems. He wasn't improvising. He was optimizing a system that worked. Every abandoned home translated into leverage, acquisition, or financial advantage. Insurance claims, forced sales, quiet transfers that looked like desperate decisions. People lost more than houses. They lost stability and trust completely. And all of it happened while everyone blamed something invisible and impossible. The longer fear lasted, the more profitable it became for him. That's what made it worse than a single act of sabotage. I didn't confront him with theories or accusations at first. I brought data, samples, timelines, and documented environmental changes. Everything laid out in a way that removed interpretation completely. He met me in his office, calm, almost bored by the situation. I explained how the compound worked and how it spread through vents. I showed him the residue patterns across the multiple properties he controlled. Then I connected the purchases made after each evacuation event. For a moment, he didn't say anything at all. Just watched me like he was deciding how much to deny. He told me correlation doesn't prove intent or direct involvement. That was true, and he knew exactly how to use it. But he couldn't explain access logs tied to his maintenance contractors. He couldn't explain the lab match between samples and his supply purchases. His silence changed from confidence to calculation in seconds. No confession, no dramatic breakdown, nothing that simple or clean. Just a man realizing the mask no longer protected him. And that was enough for everything else to follow. Sometimes I still think about that hallway I saw first. The way it felt deeper than it should have been. Back then, I almost believed something was waiting there. That's the part people don't like admitting later. We want to think we're immune to that kind of fear. That would question things instead of accepting impossible explanations. But most people didn't question anything once it felt real. Their senses told them something was wrong, and they trusted that completely. They didn't know those senses were being quietly manipulated. A slight chemical shift, a vibration, a subtle distortion of perception. That's all it took to rewrite reality in their minds. No ghosts, no portals, just a mechanism they couldn't recognize. And someone who understood exactly how to use that ignorance. So the question is whether something supernatural existed there. The question is how easily we accept it when pushed carefully. How fast we trade understanding for fear when reality feels unstable. Because without knowing the mechanism, science and mystery look exactly the same.